And so under FPAS Part 2, we try to emphasize economics more. And that means starting off with all the great papers that we like and know about, starting with, for example, Friedman's presidential address in 1968, but all kinds of things that we would have as economists and traineers of the types of papers that we would want economists to read. So we've asked everybody to give us their top 10 list. And what's amusing about it is that the intersection of those top 10 is special. I would say most of us have maybe 3 or 4, but then there's about 6 or 7 that each of us have that where they're different than everybody else. And that is actually fleshing out the top 20 list, the top 30 list, and the top 40 list. So the way we're thinking about that as a local approximation is to tell our level 1 GFS students, we'll give them the whole list, but these are the top 10 from people like Larry, Hamid Farouque, Giannis Halikas, who's also here, who studied under Franco Bedigliati and James Tobin. So we've asked them all. I'm going to start with Larry, because his list is actually quite special. He's got a lot of things on his list that's not on the rest of our list. So I'm going to start off with Larry. He's former deputy governor of the Bank of Canada. He graduated from MIT. What year did you graduate from MIT?
1984.
So that was like just rock stars that came out of MIT back in those years. But then he went to the Carleton University and spent 15 years there. And then went to the Bank of Canada.
Spent 25 years there.
And now he's with us, and he's going to tell us what is on his top 10 list. So please.
So thanks, Doug. This is a great opportunity. I'm going to be a little biased in my choices, and I'm going to sort of do them in chronological order as I read them as a student and as a researcher. So the first article I ever read in my first year at university was a paper called The Simple Analytics of General Welfare Maximization. And this was written by Francis Bator, who was a professor at Harvard, and it was in the QJE. And the reason I read it was when I took first year economics, the professor I had did not do the traditional Samuelson course in economics. He did this article, which is essentially a graphical analysis of general equilibrium. I mean, it's a beautiful paper in that it does consumption, it gets production, it derives the production possibility frontier and the grand utility frontier, and it determines the allocation of resources, prices, and wages. And when I saw this paper and saw this presentation in my class, it just blew my mind at how powerful economics was. I didn't intend to be an economist, but the professor who taught the course and showed me the paper became my mentor. He went to MIT, and he's the reason I really became an economist, and this paper was part of it. So it's a very introductory paper, but if you're new to economics, I'd encourage you to read it because it really gives you a sense of the elegance and the power of the economics. The next paper I'll point out was a paper that Doug just mentioned, which I read my second year macro course, the Friedman's AEA presidential address. And I think that's the bedrock of the way many macroeconomists think of today in terms of our modeling and how we conduct policy. So I won't dwell on that because I'm sure others will speak on that as well. And then in third year macroeconomics, I learned the solo growth model, which again is a very powerful model, very elegant, and I think very useful. And then as I branched out, my interests were in international economics. And so I took courses in international economics, and there's a number of ones that I really love that I still occasionally go back to. And one of them is Milton Friedman's The Case for Flexible Exchange Rate, which was written in the early 50s. And Friedman actually played a role in Canada adopting a flexible exchange rate in 1950. We were the first country to actually leave the Bretton Woods system in 1950. We rejoined it in 1962, but left again in 1970. So we're the advanced country that has the longest experience with flexible exchange rates. And so I consider myself one of the strongest proponents of flexible exchange rates. And that's largely due to Milton Friedman because of the power of that article to really show that flexible exchange rate can really facilitate adjustment in an open economy to external shocks. The other article, which is on the other side, is Mundell's Optimal Currency Areas, which was written by him in the early 1960s and published in the ER. And there's a story that all his initial papers were actually proofread by his mother, who was an English teacher. So but Mundell, again, was a famous international economist. He happened to be Canadian, won the Nobel Prize, and that's one of my favorite papers. And then the other side of Mundell is his contribution to the Mundell-Fleming model, which is really elegant in the sense that it shows he was actually inspired by Canada's experience with a flexible exchange rate in the 1950s. Because what happened in Canada is that we had a governor at the Bank of Canada who wanted to increase savings by Canadians. And he thought by raising the interest rate, by tightening monetary policy and raising savings, that would raise savings. But in fact, what it did do is it appreciated the exchange rate and slowed the economy, just as the Mundell-Fleming model would predict. And the government at the time was worried about the slowing economy. And so what they did was they did expansionary fiscal policy, which if you study the Mundell-Fleming model, you know that makes things even worse because the exchange rate appreciates by more. And so Mundell heard the story of the Canadian experience from a Canadian official in an elevator at the IMF. And that was the spark for Mundell's contribution to the Mundell-Fleming model. So he published that paper, and there are different versions, but the original one I think is in the Canadian Journal of Economics in the early 60s. And it really shows how monetary and fiscal policy work together in an open economy, and it's definitely worth reading. The other paper that, speaking about finance, I did take some finance when I was an undergrad, and the most elegant paper in the finance field I found is really the Modigliani and Miller model, which shows how the capital structure of a firm in theory shouldn't matter. I mean, that's under certain assumptions, but it's really a very elegant derivation of the theorem. I learned that in my finance class. And then as I went to grad school, I learned other things, and again, it was in international economics, and I won't go on for too much longer. One is the Lucas Islands model, which is really a formalization, in my view, of the Friedman presidential address, because it shows that inflation can really harm the efficiency of an economy because it makes the signal from relative price changes hard to ascertain. And we all know in economics that it's relative prices that determine the efficient allocation of resources. And so I think what Lucas did in that paper, which I think is the most noteworthy of the rational expectations of the new classical school, is really showed something that is important to central bankers, that high inflation distorts the relative price signals and leads to an inefficient allocation of resources in the economy. And I'll close with a couple open economy models that I learned in graduate school. One was the Dornbush overshooting model. And Dornbush was a very clever man, and what he did was he took the Mundell-Fleming model and he extended it to incorporate rational expectations. But it was very clever what Dornbush did. He allowed rapid adjustment in asset markets. So asset like exchange rates and interest rates. So he said that adjustment in those markets was fast, whereas adjustment in the goods market was slow because prices were sticky. So the combination of rapid adjustment in asset markets versus slow adjustment in goods market is what produces exchange rate overshooting. And it's a remarkable paper, and it's like got millions of citations, but it's really very insightful about how a modern economy works. And I'll close with one paper by Paul Krugman. He's written many papers, but this is one of my favorites. It's about current account crises, how exchange rate regimes, fixed exchange rate regimes collapse when there is fiscal dominance. And it's a beautiful paper and well worth reading. So I'll stop there, I know.
So thanks. Now I have a different version of what we say when we mean elevator economics. A much better version, I